Hello, everybody. I'm a practicing therapist and a doctoral student of psychology. Today, I want to talk about why deep thinkers see the world differently. Why their perspective, because they are a deep thinker, sometimes they apply things very differently, perceive things differently, and even believe things differently than those who are what research in 2014 does describe as someone who is shallow thinking. And you can have both. You can fluctuate between the two depending on your perspective, what you think is necessary, and how you communicate with other people. So it's important to realize that sometimes you can be shallow thinking and sometimes you can be deep thinking. However, this would be somebody who is predominantly more thinking more introspectively, to which they do overall see the world differently. But before we actually go into that, I want to actually define what deep thinking is based on a couple of the research that I'm reading. All of it's in the description box, so we're going to talk about it in detail in this video today. Deep thinking is someone who engages in reflective and analytical thinking. It's typically deliberate. Even if it's not necessarily always deliberate, it definitely started that way, which means if you started as a deep thinker when you were young, you did stop and ponder upon things. Now maybe you do it so almost intuitively that you're not necessarily realizing it's deliberate, but at one point it definitely was a conscious choice. Now it is, but maybe it's more in your subconscious as well as conscious. It might fluctuate between the two. And what we're seeing is that you're actually seeking the understanding of things, the patterns, the causes, the meanings, rather than just the immediate answers. And this is very important. However, it doesn't mean that if you're a deep thinker, you cannot also have faster, more, less reflective thoughts. That is what we call shallow thinking based on research in 2014. And that was based on cognitive psychology, which is where a lot of this is pulled from, the branch of cognitive psychology. Hello, everybody. Today is the video that a lot of you guys have been requesting, and I finally was able to compile all the things that you wanted. Now, a lot of you guys wanted services from me, so I think that's really important. So I'm going to go over all the pieces by first introducing myself. My name is Amber with an N, so Amber, but with an N. It's not any fancy pronunciation, A-N as in Nancy, B-E-R, Amber. And I am licensed in Virginia and DC, and I'm working on Maryland, so it might be Maryland as well. So I can't see patients in California, for example. I'm only licensed in a couple areas. I might go for West Virginia and Florida, depending, but that's in the works. However, the reason why I bring that up is because a lot of you guys don't want therapy. You wanted consulting. However, I can't do consulting. Like, I'm licensed as a therapist, and I can't just combine both those things into one practice. And I've been practicing with my master's license for a while, but now that I'm getting my doctorate, and soon once I get licensed for that, it was going to create a lot of issues if I put them all under the same thing. It's not going to make sense, because you can go from your master's to your doctorate license and you don't have to change your practice information. You just update your license information. However, with consulting, that's not a license. Any random person can do it. And so actually, it creates more ethical issues for me. So the only way that this works, and I've asked a couple of my colleagues who do the same thing, you have to have two separate, distinct entities, or if it's not distinct, it has to be doing business as, and so it's separate enough. And so the only way that I could achieve that is I have a separate website, among other things, part of my practice, but you guys don't need to know the nitty gritty of stuff like that, so that I could offer consulting practices. But in order to do so, I need to have, at least this is how I'm doing it, I want to have a specific intake form. And so I do have that. Obviously for therapy, I have an intake form, but I do want to talk about this today so that you guys know if you want consulting with me, it's not going to be like therapy. You're not going to see me every week. It's not like that. My patients, I see them once a week, sometimes twice a week, depending. You guys are going to see me like maybe just once, just that session, or every now and again. I'm not going to diagnose you. And if you want to see me in consulting, you cannot see me as a patient, because that's dual relationships and I cannot do that. In every licensing board, I do want you guys to keep that in mind. I can see you, like, let's say multiple times, but it is not going to be something that is a reoccurring therapeutic relationship, right? As a therapist, I know my patients in and out. I know what they do. I know what they eat. Sometimes I know more than I should know, but I do, and it's all confidential. That doesn't mean what we're sharing in consulting is not confidential. I still will follow those same ethics, and that's something that I'm just going to do, because in general, that also still protects me. So the confidentiality is going to be the same. However, it does mean that if you guys are looking for a diagnosis for like borderline or something like that, you're going to have to come to Virginia And then you can get a diagnosis from me there. But there are plenty of folks who know how to diagnose that, so that's not too much of an issue. I can resolve the communication issues in consulting, but I cannot resolve the medical stuff, which is going to be only in therapy. But I want you guys to understand that these things are not going to be, they're not the same. I'm not going to have you like be in my therapy portal. So like I use Therapy Notes. Some people use Simple Practice. When I was an intern, my supervisor used Simple Practice. And so I got used to Simple Practice. I've used Theranos, which is now called Insora before. That's like the electronic health record platform, which is where like a lot of the communication goes, like the paperwork, etc. But I can't do that with consulting. Plus I want to keep them separate. And so you're not going to have access to like an electronic health records where you can send me documents or I can ask for a document. It can't be like that. And so I have to put it all on like one page. So what I did was on a website, I just put the document there, and then then you can get that whatever session you want, you can purchase that particular session and then you can schedule it with me. And so all of that has to come into one spot. And so you have to do it at the same time instead of like in electronic health records, you can kind of do it on your own time before the session because you're in the portal and I can see you and you can see me. Like that you're always going to be part of that portal if you're my patient, and I'm always going to be part of that portal. So I can ask you for a document or some insurance information and you can send it when you have it or when it's needed or necessary. But for this one, you have to do it all at the same time. Otherwise, you can't even see me because there's no portal. So I just wanted to explain that to you. And so I have 3 setups. Some of that is based on how I set up my therapy, but it's going to be different. So with therapy, I do family sessions. I'm not going to do any family. So no children in any of these sessions, the consulting sessions. I'm going to do couples consulting and individuals consulting. So for therapy, I have 45-minute slots and 55-minute slots. For consulting, I want to do it as concise as possible. So I want you guys to just basically tell me what you need and we can work on solutions together. It's going to be 30-minute slots and 45-minute slots. I'm also going to do emailing. Now, particularly, I'm going to do like emailing, asking a question where you will ask me one question, just one. You can give me the detailed background and then I will answer within a certain amount of time. And then that will be that particular service. But I think that these things are important for you guys to have or be aware of. Throughout the videos, I'm going to put some more information or updated information if I add more services or whatever it is, and that'll clip within videos so that you know what you're looking for. So the basic point is everything's going to be on just like one website, but my therapy is going to be a separate website. But very likely you guys will not be needing therapy because you're just looking for particular dynamics. You're just having like one question or 2 questions or whatever it is about your dating dynamics. So likely you're not going to need my therapy information, but I still have my license information on the consulting website just so you are aware of it. But understand that the consulting portion, it's not using my license. So you cannot reimburse those services. And I'm sorry for that. I really wanted it to be where I could use my license so that you could reimburse it. But that you cannot do that. And there's a lot of ethics that create issues with. So that is, you cannot reimburse consulting services. Therapy services you can, but you cannot. So I just want you guys to be aware of that. I'm going to continuously add more details and clarification and questions you guys have. But for now, we're going to leave it at this. So let's talk about some attributes and traits that people who are deep thinkers tend to have. Now, I think this one is the most obvious one. They tend to be introspective of themselves. Deep thinkers do examine their own thoughts, beliefs, and their motivations. They often engage in self-monitoring and metacognition, which helps them to evaluate their ideas more critically and develop deeper understanding, or that's the goal. And typically we see that. This is the same research 2014. And we do see that often we're seeing the difference between those who have a more shallow thinking predominantly versus deep. This doesn't necessarily mean that those who are shallow thinking are not introspective. It's just not as common, or it might even be less reflective. And there are benefits to both styles of thinking. And we're going to talk about the pros and cons as well of deep thinking towards the middle end of this video. So that research was 2014. The next one is they often challenge common ideas that are common in our society. So often folks who are deep thinking do not take things at face value. This can be challenging because a lot of people might perceive this as people who are argumentative, where it is not necessarily argumentative. It's just that they want to understand things from a different angle. They want to be sure. They want to make sure that they understand that these widely accepted ideas were thoroughly vetted, which I think is a very reasonable perspective, and I can understand that to some extent. The next one is that they tend to have abstract reasoning or analytical reasoning, whichever perspective you want to say it. This research was in 2011, and it does seem that folks who are deep thinking do prefer to analyze problems at a more conceptual level, and they're trying to find the structures underneath these concepts. They almost go beyond what some people might say is like surface level to understand the how and why things happen or what it necessarily does. Now, this is interesting because it doesn't necessarily mean people who do this always have a high IQ. I think this is kind of, yes, IQ does have some correlation, but it doesn't always, because some folks who have a high IQ, sometimes they start learning as they grow up that this can cause it can sometimes be too overthinking. And we'll talk about that with the pros and cons, which is why some people actually, even if this is their nature when they're younger, they just learn to grow out of it. And so you might be that person. So it doesn't mean you're not a deep thinker necessarily, or you're not intelligent. If you don't fit this particular one, it just might be because you have so many other things going on. The next one is an interesting one. I really like this, 2021, is that sometimes they actually have a comfort in complex ideas. It's almost like some people might even word it as a tolerance for complexity. Deep thinkers are usually comfortable with these aspects, which means they are willing to explore multiple possibilities rather than seeking simplistic answers. Now, it does depend. If you have a diagnostic impression of generalized anxiety disorder, you might not have this one, but you still are a deep thinker. So take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt, as always. Take anything you hear with a grain of salt and try and understand where it's coming from, vet it. So same thing with any of my videos. Take it with a grain of salt. Don't take it too harsh. The next one is we're going to see a two-system thinking where they have more deliberate reasoning, and it tends to be slower. Deep thinkers tend to rely on controlled reasoning rather than just automatic responses. And so what we see is there's a model. It's where the system is more slower and reflective. So they take one section, they're kind of processing something before they come up with an idea. So if you're thinking about why something happens, you first ponder on those aspects, you break that apart, and then from that point, you come up with some conclusions or at least some understanding, even if you fully don't understand it, which is why a lot of people who tend to think deep, they are okay with not having immediate answers because often they believe that not everything has an answer, and that's okay. The next one is the meaning seeking and insight. Because they believe that not everything has an answer, there is a part of them that actually believes that searching continuously or trying to find more and more of a depth meaning has benefit. It doesn't mean it's the full picture, but they always believe that there can be more to learn. This research was 2017. Often we see that these individuals have a disposition toward intellectual humility, and they actually believe and understand that they have a limit to their knowledge and they have a motivation to learn. And so that's very important. I really like that. So what are the advantages of being a deep thinker? One of them is better decision making based on research in 2011. Because you have that two-system thinking, you are more able to make more informed decisions. And you're able to weigh the pros and cons more carefully. Typically, the reason why we say that is better decision making is because you are able to take a little bit more time. Now, that's not always the case. There is a reality that sometimes you might process things a little bit too overly to some extent, to which you may actually miss more basic concepts, which is part of a con, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. The next one is improved problem solving. This one's very important. Deep thinkers are actually better at analyzing the root causes, which means they're better at anticipating consequences and generating more creative solutions to some extent. Research in 2014, which does help with problem solving. Those are elements to problem solving in psychology. The next one is, like we had mentioned, open-mindedness and intellectual humility. We touched on this a little bit before 2017. They are a little bit more humble, for lack of better words, because they understand the limit of their own knowledge, and they appreciate that other people know more than them, which I think most people are. I shouldn't say most people are like this, but I feel like somewhere we all understand this, just maybe it's harder to accept. But I think a lot of us want to learn, and we're all lifelong learners. I hope that is the case. I could be wrong, but I do feel like it's a good concept or trait. The next one is enhanced learning and knowledge retention. This is based on research in 2006, and this one is really important. Deep thinkers actively integrate new information with existing knowledge, and they're able to reflect and form new concepts as well. It actually enhances long-term retention for knowledge, because their knowledge that they have always had, for example, or had for a long time, not always, they're able to add to it and edit it. So it's not just something sitting in their subconscious. They are actively looking at these things and reflecting, which actually helps them to increase that learning. It's a very similar mechanism to if you're teaching somebody something, you're actually retaining that knowledge even more. That's the same concept. Not always the case. I think there's some mixed research about that. We don't need to touch on that. The next one is higher likelihood to be more self-aware. Because you are more reflective and you're engaging in that metacognition, you're able to understand your own motivations, biases, and emotions, and you're able to reflect that and also learn more about your mistakes and also resolve those things, as well as just understand who you are better, which is good. The next one is these folks tend to be more creative, 1999. By exploring multiple perspectives and also tolerating that ambiguity, you're actually more likely to generate novel insights, which is just really interesting. And typically the creative solutions can sometimes come from actually a creative medium, but doesn't always have to. You might just be a creative thinker, but we do see it's applied in a creative medium, such as art, writing, etc. The next portion we're going to talk about are the challenges, and then we're going to wrap it up. The challenges to somebody who's a deep thinker is overthinking, or we could even say like analysis paralysis. We touched on this very slightly in the beginning, research in 2006. It is true that folks who are deep thinkers tend to spend excessive time analyzing situations, and this can sometimes delay decision making, which can lead to stress and sometimes miss opportunities. Now, I will say that some people have a balance of both, which is what we talked about. You can be a deep thinker and a shallow thinker. What, unfortunately, I will say is people who are intelligent, a lot of them are deep thinkers, but sometimes it's not always the case. There is trauma involved with some people who are deep thinkers, because we do also see people who have a higher IQ. They tend to fluctuate between the both. But those people who have a higher IQ who can fluctuate between the both, they tend to have higher protective factors in childhood. And so what that means is they're more comfortable not worrying about everything. Not saying this is always the reason why people deep think, but because they trust that life is okay. And that's the next point we're going to talk about. People who are deep thinkers, especially those who have a traumatic background, they tend to worry excessively. Research in 2008, they tend to ruminate a lot. And the reason why this can be different with those who are intelligent / even deep thinkers who do not come from a traumatic background is because they do not believe that everything needs to be dissected to such an extent, because they overall believe that it's going to be okay. And typically people who have more protective factors, they tend to have more of a support system. And so they have other things their mind is thinking about, right? If somebody doesn't have a support system and they were not nurtured properly as a child and raised properly, they tend to get married later. They tend to have less friends. And so they tend to have less areas where their mind is divided. So they have more time to actually reflect, which is a good thing. But as we mentioned, it's also a risk. The next one is you may have difficulty simplifying things. Deep thinkers do struggle to communicate ideas in a little bit more of a concise way, because it's harder to a lot of folks who are deep thinking, even if you are somebody who can fluctuate between the two, it tends to be that it's harder for you to give information, because you feel like if you minimize that information, you're reducing some of the important aspects of it. This research was in 2006. The next one is you actually may be susceptible to decision fatigue. Research in 1998. As we had discussed, making some of these decisions from this type of perspective is prolonged. And so sometimes you can be a little bit tired of that, tired of actually processing those things, which makes you sometimes procrastinate, actually. The next one is social misunderstanding. Now, this one is more common if you have trauma. Not all the time, though. You may not have trauma and still have these things. But because deep thinkers often prefer reflective analysis, complexities, etc., sometimes they may struggle with social situations or collaborative contexts because some individuals are not like that. 1997. However, if you have a little bit more protective factors, you learn at an early age how to combine the two. Sometimes you're a shallow thinker, sometimes you're a deep thinker. The last point that we're going to touch on is that I just want to mention that if you are a deep thinker and you have had trauma, I'm not saying that that's necessarily something you need to fix. I'm not even judging you. I'm just sharing this information because it was requested, and we've talked about this a little bit before, but you guys wanted me to make an updated video on it, and so that's why I just wanted to do it. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It's a good thing. I think it's a good thing, and there's nothing to be ashamed of about it. And I appreciate you guys. I want you guys to have the best life possible. I know I can't do that through videos, but I do hope that at some point you guys get what you're looking for. The research is in the description box. Please like, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.